With that very light overview of the grammar and the context for how it came into being, let's turn now to looking at the structure of the grammar.
In this second video, we're going to look at the first pillar of universal grammar of story, the call to write and the way we respond.
Three primal forces call us to write. They call to awaken an ancient writer archetype within us. This archetype is the cultural scout, whose job it is to guide us along the uncharted edges of what in our time is an increasingly dangerous social frontier. These forces call out from the personal depths within us. It comes from the social world around us. And a third comes from the mythological realm. The primal calls are spontaneous and intuitive. It's very similar to dreaming at night. You don't will a particular dream into your head when you sleep, with the exception of lucid dreaming, which is a type of dreaming where we will certain kinds of dreams. But generally, a dream just arrives in your mind. And this is how stories come to us. They generally just arrive in our mind. And it's my philosophy that stories emanate from the same places in our unconscious that dreams emanate. And if you look at this brain scan, it shows the activity of the brain during sleep and the activity of the brain during waking times. So much more is happening in the brain during sleep, and especially during the REM period of sleep, where in just seconds you have an experience that to your conscious mind, when you remember it the next day, must have taken a long time. But sleep scientists tell us that they're just a flash. The personal call reaches out to us from our own private unconscious to help us untangle unfinished business in our own psychology. Here, we can deal with grief and loss from the safe distance of fiction. You never have to know about this. You never have to consciously recognize that you're working something out in your own life. But to seasoned writers, it's very clear, the more a hero is so good and a villain is so bad, we know that this writer is new in their field and hasn't worked through the personal call yet. At some point, the writer must let the story go to become an entity of its own. You do this by releasing it from the personal call, by letting it go, by letting it come out of its own shell and be its own being. If you don't do this, the story will go on strike. It will refuse to let you write anymore, because you're like a parent that's smothering the grown adolescent who's ready to go to college now, and you want that child to go back into the nursery. The social call emanates from the collective unconscious. The greater society is asking its artists to provide metaphors and images for the grand collective dream in order to work out unfinished business in the collective unconscious. It differs from the personal call in that with the personal call, there are lots of different reasons that you're writing. You have problems coming and going across the course of your life, and the motivation to write a story changes from problem to problem. But with the social call, artists are asked to address a single generational struggle. They are providing collective dream images for the dream of the society for one issue alone. It is the same issue across all artists, across their entire lifetimes. It is the generational dream. If you don't adequately address that call, you will encounter audience block. If you don't answer the personal call correctly, you get writer's block. But if you don't address the audience need for the social call, they will turn away from you. They will say that your work is out of date or it's out of touch. The social call in our era is asking, how do we get back together again? We have become so scattered and fragmented from each other that we hardly know how to reunite. In the last era, the struggle was, how do we maintain our humanity against the industrial machine? And we had stories like Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times becoming a cog in a machine. And we had Franz Kafka telling us that the machine is overtaking us. The main theme was, how do we retain our humanity? But now it's, how do we get back together again? How do we reform and reunite as tribes, as packs? After some 200,000 years, that would be since the dawn of Homo sapiens in the world, we have lived in intergenerational tribes of deeply bonded people who could not imagine life outside the tribe, for being outside the tribe meant being outside of life. But in the span of a single generation, we moved away from the grandparents and aunties and uncles who helped raise all the kids, to living in little brownstone apartments in cities near factories, where just mom and dad and a handful of kids made their way through the world on their own. Now, a century later, dealing with the excruciating pain of alienation and loneliness, we want to know, how can we retribe? How can we find each other again? And if not with our own biological family, how can we create tribes that are deeply meaningful, that can survive conflict? The elders would have told us 100 years ago on the farm that no relationship can deepen beyond the superficial realm until the people involved experience hard conflict with one another, survive the conflict, and discover something new within each other from the conflict, which actually brings them closer. So discord and fighting is what brings us closer and allows us to unite on a deeper level. But we've lost the magic, we've lost the mentorship and instruction on how to do that. The final of the 3 primal calls to write is the mythological call. Of course, this is going to be the most mysterious and difficult one to grasp. But essentially, it is a deep human craving for a moment of shared reverence. This is a moment when we are allowed to get outside of our individual selves and feel that we are one in a group, that a body of people becomes one. The mythological call comes through the audience, but it does not come from the audience, and the writer cannot willfully put it into a story. The writer has to attract it to the audience, who brings it in and releases it into the story. Now, this comes and goes in a flash. This is what Joseph Campbell called the elixir of life, or the elixir of the gods. Just a writer gives one little spark and it's gone, but when millions of writers each contribute such a flash, that's what sustains us. It's that moment of awe when the audience, the hero, and of course the writer are freed from the individual ego. We are freed from the prison of the isolated self for a fleeting moment. We forget we're watching a movie or reading a book or listening to a great symphony. And we are outside of time and space and completely integrated into a moment of grandeur. Now let's shift into how we respond to the primal forces calling us into a story. And these forces call not just a writer to write a story, but they are also what calls your audience to come and listen to what you've brought, to come and read, to come and be a part of what you've brought. They have the same craving. We respond to the call with 3 different modes of thinking, through logic, emotion, and intuition. And James Baldwin, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Albert Einstein all were masters of these three modes of thinking equally well. It is a serious challenge to bring balance in this type of thinking, especially from a Western world paradigm. In the Western world, we devote all of our resources in education to advancing the logical thinking capacity of our young people in order to gather information. We are information gluttons. We cannot seem to reach a point of satisfaction, even though we're drowning in oceans of information that we can't use. We are obsessed with getting ever more. And in pursuit of that, in the 1700s, there was a teaching assistant at Oxford named William Farish. And he came up with what he thought was a genius idea of ranking students' papers according to a quantifiable scale. So one paper was an A, excellent, another was an F, it's not good enough to pass. And he proposed this to the Oxford professors, who thought he was crazy. They said, you can't rank people's thoughts. They're thoughts. This isn't something you can measure with a micrometer. They said that would be like saying yellow is an A and green is a C minus. How can you do that? But he did nonetheless, and now we take it for everyday life that this is a necessary part of education. With emotional thinking, we're given a little bit of instruction. Basically, we're told to suppress it. There's a few guides for context. For example, girls are allowed to cry, but boys are not. Boys are allowed to be angry, but girls are not. We're told basically to stuff what we feel and just project a facade that everything is all right. Otherwise, it's a sign of weakness. But emotional thinking is a powerfully fast means of understanding the world around us. And what we need is training in how to expand our emotions, how to engage them more powerfully in the service of a better world. With emotional thinking, in less than 1/10 of a second, we know if we're going to like a stranger. Within a very few minutes, we get the feeling if someone will be a friend or a foe. It is infinitely faster than logic. To try to go through a logical analysis of facial expression and tone of voice would take a very long time. Not so with emotion. As writers and artists, we are born emotionally gifted, but we are not given the expertise or the skill in developing this genius that lies latent within us. There is the occasional actor's training course in Stanislavski method or method acting. There are some Jungian classes in getting in touch with deeper emotions. But by and large, we are given nothing but a go out and figure it on your own and don't share it with anybody. Because we have no advancement of the emotional intellect in the West, no dedicated resources moving towards that end, we have people like Robert Bly who try to give us a little insight. Bly tells us that Westerners, by and large, cannot tell the difference between despair or depression, between irritation or anger, or between sympathy and empathy. This is huge for creative writers. You must know the nuances of all of the emotions within you, what they mean to you personally, what they mean to the wider society, and how to blend them, shape them, form them into beautiful art for the betterment of the world around you.